Hi, welcome to today's webinar. This is how much outdated tech is costing your firm. Just a couple of housekeeping things while we are getting started and getting everyone logged in. My name is Brandy Johnson. I am the CMO and co-founder of Appventory, made by Coach Bar, and I'm joined today by Luke Farren. We'll talk about Luke in just a minute here. Like I said, a couple of housekeeping notes. We do have some time reserved for Q&A at the end of the session. So feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A panel as we go. If you do have any technical difficulties, you can also drop those in there, and I will do my best to help troubleshoot as we are going through the webinar. Finally, a recording is going to be sent out after the session, so don't worry if you miss anything. You don't have to take too many notes. You'll get access to this. You'll also be able to share that with your colleagues who will want to hear this conversation as well. So a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. So accounting firms are investing more in tools than ever, but they're also losing time and money due to outdated systems, overlapping platforms, poor tech adoption, all of those things that plague us in business today. And so today with Luke, we're going to explore how to cut the waste and build a tech stack that actually supports your firm's goals, whether that's because you have disconnected systems or just outdated systems that haven't been updated in a decade. So we'll cover how to audit your firm's tech stack, learn to spot the gaps, redundancies, or inefficiencies that are holding your team back, how to align your tech spend with actual usage. So how to map costs to real outcomes and avoid overspending on underused tools. And then where automation fits in. So we'll discover how firms are using automation to replace guesswork, speed up tech discovery, and avoid costly downtime. So whether you're already deep into a digital transformation, just getting started, somewhere in between, today's session with Luke will give you practical steps to save time, reduce costs, and upgrade your tech with confidence. And I'm so delighted to be joined by Luke today. Luke is the founder of The Modern Firm, which is a consultancy that's helping UK accounting practices modernize their operations. Luke brings over 13 years of experience in the accounting sector, having worked across both small firms and large national practices. He was also part of the founding team at Clivity Advisors, which is a tech-forward firm that ran on automation and was later acquired by Cooper Perry. And now through The Modern Firm, he helps firms uncover inefficiencies, audit their systems, and make smarter tech decisions that improve profitability and performance. And I know from my experience with Luke, this is a topic that he is incredibly passionate about, and you can see that through the work that he's doing with The Modern Firm. So you can definitely connect with him on LinkedIn and explore those opportunities as well. And Luke, you're welcome to add anything as we're getting started. I'm going to pop up today's quick poll. Today's poll is first poll is how would you describe your current tech stack?
All it's worth. I'm not going to add anything, Brandy. I think you've done a better job than even I can of introducing me there. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So absolutely. So while we're giving people a minute to respond to the webinar or to the poll, let's just kind of start talking about our first question here. So looking at where many firms unintentionally leak time and money in their existing tech stack, an audit isn't just a checklist. It's about uncovering what's underused. So when you're brought into a firm to review their systems, what are some of the most common red flags that you're seeing, Luke? Let's just get right into the bad stuff. What are the big
Yeah,
red
let's
flags?
yeah, let's dive straight in. I mean, look, there's always kind of, I think, common themes that crop up amongst most accountancy firms that I'm partnering with so far, and I think historically that I've worked with or in terms of I guess red flags or kind of like common problems that exist. I think the reality is the accounting sector over the last kind of decade or so has been innovative insofar as the new kind of technologies and apps and vendors coming into the space in terms of kind of solutions to help accountancy firms run more in a more streamlined way, more profitably, however you want to coin it. But I think the actual kind of thinking and the mindset of many firms over that same period hasn't necessarily evolved in pace or in line with the kind of technology changes. And I think we're kind of at a point at the moment where we're ultimately going to enter a whole new era or a whole new kind of evolution of additional kind of AI and automation and all of those things that are going to make practices kind of significantly more streamlined and structured and able to operate in this kind of new and modern world. But the reality is, so many firms at the moment still don't have the fundamentals or the basics in place to actually kind of like set themselves up for that success. I think it's quite easy, and I talk about this regularly in terms of practices going, or turning up to conferences like DAS or speaking to vendors or listening to webinars about all of the great technology that is out there to help and support them. But the reality is, if you plug that sort of stuff into a practice that kind of doesn't have well-structured data, doesn't have well-connected systems, doesn't have kind of properly mapped out and well-structured processes, then you're ultimately setting yourself up for fail. And I think for me, a lot of what I see is kind of practices that are doing just that, getting drawn to the kind of shiny objects, the kind of, the latest and the greatest technology that exists, and thinking that by just plugging that piece of tech or tooling in, it's going to fundamentally change how they are and how they operate. But the reality is, what you end up with quite quickly is technology and apps stacked upon technology and apps that kind of are quite aren't very well interconnected, aren't particularly well structured or streamlined, data kind of, flow not where it needs to be. And ultimately, you just end up in this kind of like bag of knots, really. And I think for me, like, again, back to the kind of what red flags do you see when I go into practices or firms that I talk to, it's the fact that they've kind of been pulled in lots of different directions in terms of kind of tooling and tech that they think is really going to help them, but they don't have a particularly well thought out strategy in place or a particularly well kind of like structured view on what that end state is going to look like. And I think with all of this stuff, when you start to think about it and consider it in silos and not as part of a more holistic strategy, that's when you ultimately start to create problems and stuff. So I think for me, that's kind of one of the major red flags that I see across most firms. It's a case of, they almost know where they want to get to. The mindset, in the most part, is kind of one that wants to kind of evolve into a tech forward kind of thinking kind of accountancy practice, but they're not prepared to kind of either address or acknowledge the kind of fundamentals to be able to actually kind of put that foundation in place to get there. And yeah, for me, that centers around kind of well-structured data, technology and apps that are actually kind of being used and for the right reasons as well, which I think we'll probably come on to talk more about that as we go. But then also as well, not having kind of like loads of technical debt, kind of, misaligned processes, and yeah, really just kind of addressing those kind of basics really. So yeah, there's a few in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a great circle back to our poll because 100% of the people who participated in today's poll said that their current tech stack, they would describe it as somewhat cluttered. We use a lot of tools, but not sure if they're all necessary and effective. So I think, if we're adding in those tools and kind of hoping that this is going to be the tool that changes everything, adding another tool on the pile doesn't necessarily save you, if you will, or change everything. There's a whole process of change management that I know we'll talk about that we want to get into that.
I think so.
But from your experience, if a firm is looking how at their tech stack and they're trying to make those decisions and they recognize that they need to do a bit of a tech audit. Obviously, one option is working with you. But like what's the first step firms should take when starting a tech audit, excuse me. Is there a consistent entry point that you recommend? How does that process start and who usually starts it?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's a project that you just want to undertake internally, kind of without the support of either external consultants or external kind of solutions, obviously AppVenture is one of those in terms of a tool, which again, we can come on to talk about in terms of some use cases there. But I think for me, if you want to kind of go about this in a really kind of, basic and uniformed way, a great way to go about that would just to be kind of do a bit of analysis across your kind of, bank transactions, credit card transactions to be able to kind of summarize what kind of technology you are actually paying for each month. And I think, that sounds so basic when you kind of talk it out loud, but the reality is it can be so easy to get sucked into demos of platforms, kind of, talked into trialing particular softwares, which perhaps at the time do feel like they might serve a particular purpose. But then as we talk about, we get to a situation where priorities change, kind of, stuff crops up that means that you just don't have the capacity to kind of like fully see that trial through, or again, it's not as part of a more sort of holistic, well thought out strategy. And before you know it, the credit card details that you entered into that platform to take out a trial to see whether you liked it is suddenly going out of your bank account at 12.99 a month, times perhaps 10 different platforms that you've done that for. And before you know it, you've got, hundreds, if not thousands of pounds annually that are creeping out the back door in terms of software that you're just no longer using. And I think sometimes, again, there's obviously a spectrum, I guess, in terms of what some of these platforms and solutions cost. But when you do have quite nominal amounts of money of, 10, 20, 30 pounds a month that's going out on a credit card statement, it can be sometimes easy to either gloss over it or acknowledge it, but perhaps park it in terms of a to-do list item that you never get around to cancelling or looking at. And again, if you've got one or two of those, maybe not a material problem, but if you've got 10, 20, 30 different pieces of software that you've done that for, you suddenly end up in a situation where, again, you've got huge amounts of expenditure that's creeping out the back door. And I think doing something as simple as just taking a kind of snapshot of what your kind of financial transactions look like and trying to work out, where that money is going is obviously a helpful starting point. I was working with a client, or I'm working with a client this week, in fact, where we've done a bunch of different kind of workshops around, technology and process and people and systems and a whole bunch of other stuff in between. And during those sessions, when we started to kind of surface some of the technology and systems that the firm are using, there are some quite obvious kind of big household like names that they were kind of operating things like practice management and accounts production and stuff out of. And then after a bit more conversation, we got down into some more detail around the next layer of software. And at the point where the kind of partners in the practice kind of assumed and thought that was it, it was only when we really started to do some digging with the internal finance team and actually looked at what is going out of their bank account every month for different things that they start to remember, oh yeah, actually we've got, I don't know, Futurely plugged in over here, for example, that we're not using any longer. And, Dext plugged in over there, for example, that we're not using any longer. And as to whether or not it was those two platforms or I've just made them up is almost by the by. It's the fact that you've got software that they're kind of using that they don't realize until you really start to get into it. And it's very, very easy for that sort of stuff to hide in the background without thinking about it. So yeah, for me, I think if a firm wants to kind of go about doing that in a self-serve capacity, it's that's a good starting point.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I know, like I've even seen it in organizations that I've been a party to where, because it's so easy to enter the corporate card for that trial, that if there's not like an official procurement process, or like a large IT team that's helping manage those things, maybe you have somebody on the team who signs up for something and then they leave the organization. Um,
Mm,
and then that's just, that maybe they were using it and it was very productive for them, but it was only they were the only one using it. So then you have like this ghost software that's still being paid for and nobody is even has a login for it anymore. And but it, like you said, it's only 20 pounds a month on the card. It's coded, it slips through for an extended period. Um
100%.
so I think that's really great. So obviously you've come across situations where a significant portion of the tech budget is going toward tools that aren't being used or aren't being used effectively. Um, so how, like, once you started to identify those inefficiencies, how do you take action on that? And like, what kinds of things tend to get in the way of actually taking action and making changes?
Yeah, where do we start? So I think that it's one thing trying to identify pieces of software that are not being used at all and are sitting there as kind of technical debt that just kind of, again, is a waste of money because the platform's simply not being used. I think it's a whole different kettle of fish when it comes to platforms or softwares that are being used but aren't being used or fully activated to their fullest extent. And there's too many examples to kind of draw on in terms of platforms or solutions out there that exist that firms are using for perhaps 5 or 10% of its functionality, but the rest of the functionality that sits in the platform they're either not aware of or they're not utilizing it because they haven't got the time, or so they proclaim, to be able to figure out what the kind of true benefit of it could realize. And I personally don't think that's either a vendor problem or a kind of accountancy kind of owner firm problem. I think it's probably a blend of all of the above combined with some other external factors as well. But ultimately, when you kind of have platforms or technology that you identify that a firm is using, but again, not to its fullest extent, I guess that then goes kind of all the way back to needing to work with a practice, or even if you're doing that sort of project internally, working with your kind of internal teams to actually fully understand what the kind of use case for the platform is and could be perhaps as well, maybe as a side-by-side comparison, but also then working around how your internal workflows are currently structured, what your internal processes currently look like. Are there any inefficiencies or kind of gaps in those processes that mean you're not using a particular piece of software to its fullest extent for particular reasons? Or perhaps it's a case that actually the reason why that particular platform isn't being used to its fullest extent is because it's not fit for purpose. But again, I think not just considering that as a standalone kind of silo. So, for example, kind of looking at practice management just as a kind of practice management silo, but considering practice management in conjunction with your internal reporting or your KYC or your onboarding. And ultimately, and I'll keep using this word probably quite routinely, but looking at it more holistically as part of a well thought out and structured strategy is the only real way to realize whether or not the software that you're using or the technology that you're using is fit for purpose. And I think there are just so many firms that just don't go through that kind of process when they're actually thinking about implementing a piece of tech. And again, for me, this isn't a vendor problem necessarily. I think that vendors are very good at not only developing solutions that are great for their customers, but being able to kind of highlight and identify why that particular piece of software would do a particularly good job for that particular area. But it's not necessarily down to the vendor to work out or to probe whether or not that platform is going to be a good fit in conjunction with all the other technology that they've got, because naturally that's outside of their remit and interests, really. And if you've then got a practice or an accountancy firm internally that doesn't have the skill sets or the capability to run that own analysis themselves, you can start to see quite quickly why people get tied in knots and have tech stacked upon tech and actually kind of platforms that are disconnected and data that isn't properly flowing between each other and those sorts of things.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a great point because I think like I grew up in the era of when you bought software, it came on a disk and you installed the software. It was a desktop piece and you didn't get an additional features and functionality and they didn't expand it until you bought the disk the next year or 2 years
Mm.
later, depending. And now with cloud-based software and everything like that, all of these tools that we're using are adding features and functionality so quickly. And if you're approaching tech and saying, okay, I am looking for a point solution instead of, as you said, a holistic solution. We may not be going back and looking and saying, well, this is what we already have in our stack. Does something in our stack already accomplish this objective? And then you're just buying for you solve this specific pain point as opposed to what kind of works within your organization as a whole. I think that's
For sure.
conversations that I've had with people kind of around tech solutioning as well. Is that something
Mm.
that you've kind of seen? Is
Mm.
that part of this process is understanding if there's expansion and redundancies or how does
Yeah,
that kind of like existing tech evolution fit into the conversation?
yeah, I think that's a kind of an ongoing kind of process. I think it's a phrase that I think used the other day, saying that none of this stuff is kind of like one and done in terms of like doing it once and then forgetting about it. You constantly have to evolve that thinking and kind of the evolution around kind of how things are working together and kind of whether or not what exists currently remains best in class, etc. But to me, it goes all the way back to the original point around having the foundations kind of in place, because I think as a firm, you need to kind of get to grips with what that kind of data set looks like, where your kind of single source of truth is from a data perspective, what systems are kind of driving data flow. And I think once you've kind of got that foundation in place, the technology that you can wrap around the outside of that, be that existing technology or kind of new technology that you identify, for me, it doesn't have to all be sitting in one particular platform or one particular software. In fact, I'd go as far as saying that vendors or applications that try to do far too many things kind of under one roof don't necessarily do kind of all of those things as well as the kind of individual softwares that do those things kind of or specialize in those things. However, if you have got different pieces of tech, you need to ensure that you've got the right levels of automation and API connection or kind of like, custom, sort of like gluing together of data systems, platforms to be able to ensure that it's operating effectively. And that's where I think kind of, again, many, if not most firms go wrong. It's not understanding what their kind of source of truth is from a data perspective, not having commonality when it comes to kind of like, naming conventions or sort of like, data standardization and stuff. Not to mention it actually being glued together properly via APIs or automation or, whatever else. So, but yeah, it's kind of an ongoing process, I think.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, this is a little off our agenda, but we've been talking about like the APIs and the automations and all of those kind of things. I know for the less technically inclined, talking about getting the APIs connected and setting up automation can sound really intimidating.
Mm.
How do you help firms understand the value in that and overcome potentially that mindset of connecting APIs maybe, like I said, like intimidating. Oh, that's too techy for me. Just give me my spreadsheet, please. I'll just export this one and import that one, and I know everything will be fine.
I mean, I think if we go on a bit of a journey to answer that question in terms of like where we were a decade or so ago when kind of cloud accounting first broke onto the market, or 12, 13 years ago, whatever it was, um, maybe a bit longer than that. And ultimately at that point, kind of the likes of Zero and stuff ended up creating this kind of ecosystem that loads of different vendors and apps and kind of companies have spawned from. Um, and and sort of more recently or latterly from that QuickBooks and all the rest of it. And you've ended up creating this whole kind of ecosystem of apps that have kind of spawned out of the cloud accounting kind of era. And during the kind of early days of that, you saw lots of these apps trying to kind of connect to each other using APIs and stuff to ensure that we had data flow between platforms. And again, like if used properly back then and still to an extent now, I think APIs are a really helpful way of actually kind of plugging platforms into each other to ensure that you've got a nice flow of data from A to B to C. I think over that period and since then, things have got even easier and more sophisticated when it's come to being able to use the likes of my headphones have just said they died in my ear. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, fantastic. Let's keep going. But I think since then you've kind of you've got to a point where kind of like low code and no code automation to be able to actually kind of bolt platforms and products together kind of outside of that sort of native API world have become not just more accessible but easier for firms to be able to actually to be able to navigate. And I think what you've seen, or what you're starting to see by way of solutions like Zapier and Make and all of the other kind of low code tools that exist out there now, are solutions that even kind of like, relatively, well, people that have got low kind of like tech proficiency and stuff are able to use with a bit of training and guidance to actually kind of knit all of these solutions together in a more sophisticated way than what the traditional kind of like API route perhaps would offer. And I think if you kind of take it one step further than that now in terms of where perhaps things are headed into the future, I think, the kind of advancements and expansions of things like, data warehouses and kind of like more common sort of ways to be able to structure multiple different data sets across different systems, to be able to use them and query them in ways that are helpful to the particular firm, again, are going to become even easier and more accessible. And I think all of that stuff, perhaps to some people now, historically and moving forward, has been or is perceived to be a little bit daunting and stuff. And granted, it's not always something that people are going to be able to kind of like roll their sleeves up and implement or deliver themselves without either external support or kind of like upskilling or training in their own respective areas. But I think it's going to become much more of a kind of like nice to have thing in terms of having these systems and stuff bolted together properly, talking to each other, connected. It's going to become kind of fundamental to the existence of most firms moving forward. And I think anybody that remains kind of skeptical or concerned about how that particular world is going to kind of like evolve for them ultimately just need to kind of, I guess, get on board with that reality. And that's the fact that this stuff is going to become much more essential and much more mainstream and kind of, yeah, important for firms that want to remain relevant in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, because I know, like I said, sometimes you start talking about APIs and automation, and it's like talking to me about taxes and audit. Like, I can handle APIs and automation all day. You talk to me about taxes and audit, and I get a little frazzled feeling. So it's great to understand how to take steps toward that, and also maintain an element of confidence and calm through it. Um, so kind of getting us back on track. So what we were talking about before we were talking about stitching everything together was
Mm.
really kind of understanding those tools that people are bringing in and how easy it is to bring in those tools. So what strategies or frameworks do you recommend to firms that want to regularly check in on their usage and ensure their tech investments are truly supporting their business outcomes?
Yeah, again, I think if I was to try and simplify this, it's kind of an ever evolving and ongoing process in terms of actually kind of, what is working for them currently and what might work for them kind of moving forward as service lines evolve, as kind of like the team expands and grows, as the kind of market shifts and changes in terms of expectations of what clients want or need delivering, etc. So I think ultimately, as a starting point, it's a kind of ongoing process. It's not a case of either internally or with the support of external consultants going into a firm, doing this stuff, redesigning everything, and then assuming that's going to be relevant in, 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time. I think things constantly have to be monitored and evolving. I think in terms of what frameworks and stuff you end up applying to any of those processes, again, for me, it goes back to, well, firstly, stating that all firms, I think, are quite unique and different. You obviously have kind of commonalities that exist across profiles of practices, size of practices, maybe the types of work that they're delivering in their portfolios. But I think that the devil's always within the detail, and the nuance that exists across particular practices will kind of mean that although you can look to apply common, I guess, processes and frameworks across surfacing kind of where the tech gaps might be or the process inefficiencies might lie, I think each firm is going to have a slightly different and nuanced approach to how it kind of works for them. Um, I personally find that kind of, just identifying the right internal kind of stakeholders that have got kind of, I guess, interest or buy-in to the kind of problems that you're trying to solve, and just actually having some kind of honest and open conversations around what's working, what's not working, and then ultimately trying to back that up with, well-structured and mapped out kind of processes is probably, the best way to start thinking about kind of whether or not the technology that's in place is fit for purpose or whether things need kind of revisiting or kind of evolving. But I'd be lying if I said there was kind of like a very standardized kind of set of checks and balances and frameworks that you can overlay, or at least I can overlay onto any practice to be able to surface that information without needing to have that more kind of, I guess, nuanced and tailored approach.
Yeah, so with that kind of auditing process, how often do you see that, like, do you recommend that firms can undertake it? I understand you can't set it up once and expect it to be working for you 5 years from now. But is that something that they need to do on an annual basis, a quarterly basis? Is it a rotation? How often would you be doing those types of audits?
I think, yeah, without trying to sound too much like a politician in terms of answering this and sort of staying too sort of like, center line on it. I think, again, the devil will be in the detail. It will depend on the size of the firm. I think if you're a kind of much smaller practice, for example, you probably don't have to go through that particular cycle as regularly as a firm that's maybe 50 or so people plus big. I mean, again, I guess just as a real tangible example, the practice that I'm working with at the moment, a firm based in the south of England who are around about 50 people in size, kind of different internal service lines across audit, tax, accounts, and payroll, sort of like, four partners or key decision makers. We've kind of talked about with that particular practice, once we've undergone this kind of audit and implementation phase, that there'll probably be a 12 monthly cycle that we go through to kind of like review and refresh any of the existing technology or systems or process or people changes that we end up making. I guess if you compare that to a practice that I've recently finished working with over in Ireland, who are about only 3 or 4 people in size currently, so a much smaller profile of firm. They're not doing audit, for example. They're only focused around kind of tax and accounts. That particular practice, we've said, or we haven't actually set any kind of parameters around when we'd next week need to revisit that, because I think the feeling is that the kind of stakeholder set internally is small enough to be able to actually kind of and mature enough to be able to surface perhaps when problems or pain points might end up arising again that need addressing. And so I think if you take those two kind of examples, it starts to sort of, set the sort of scene around for me. I think it is going to depend based on size of firm, profile of firm. But the reality is you definitely want to be looking at this stuff and at least thinking about this stuff on a routine and regular basis. Um, Again, I think kind of at a minimum for larger organizations, kind of a 12 monthly cycle. And I think just to kind of maybe reiterate and add some further color to that example that I've just talked about there, that particular practice is also looking to engage the modern firm on a more kind of regular, kind of like monthly sort of consultancy arrangement that will kind of facilitate wider kind of training workshops and kind of, I guess, some of the softer stuff that wraps around the change management piece that maybe isn't kind of a full internal audit or system analysis, but is kind of still being involved in terms of actually ensuring that the change management and the training amongst the staff and stuff kind of is kept up to date. So, yeah, I think it can depend ultimately, but I think that for me hopefully gives a couple of different sort of examples for you there.
Yeah, yeah, that's incredibly useful. And I do think it's an interesting point because when you are in the smaller organizations, you have your hands on everything so much more on a day-to-day basis versus in the larger organizations. If you're not doing the work on the day-to-day basis, it's easy for processes to migrate away from your set ideal state. And people evolve and change and find workarounds and things like that. So if you're not going back and reevaluating those touch points on a regular basis. So
For sure.
in terms of those types of audits and aligning tech, what role do you see automation playing in modern tech discovery? Is it really helping firms move faster and smarter? Are there still limitations? Where we talked about automation earlier, but in
Yeah,
full tech discovery kind of space.
yeah, I mean, look, I think it plays or can and is going to play a huge part moving forward, right? I mean, given the fact we're on an App Venture webinar, it probably would be criminal of me not to reference kind of like the type of stuff that you guys can do in terms of being able to kind of expose and kind of sort of, surface kind of like technology kind of insights and stuff using platforms like App Venture. And frankly, that's quite kind of, well, it's new and innovative. And I don't think kind of any other solutions exist in the market that can do that sort of stuff. And for me, I think the beauty of being able to plug a platform into a kind of set of like zero data or QuickBooks data or whatever it ends up being, and being able to surface really tangible insights around not just the type of technology that the firm is being used. And again, if we go back to my earlier example around kind of being able to do that manually, perhaps by extracting kind of data in Excel and looking at it and looking where the subscriptions are. Um, Obviously, that's quite clunky and time consuming. Being able to do that in a more automated, kind of more visual way using App Venture is super helpful. But also then being able to kind of shed insights around exactly kind of where the gaps might be in terms of maybe some of the in terms of some of the usages of those platforms, or perhaps kind of insights as to where duplication or overlap might exist. Without needing to kind of really drill down into what the platforms are if you were doing a comparable exercise using Excel and stuff. So I think for me, firms that can kind of utilize technologies like App Venture to do that in a more autonomous way are going to realize a huge amount of kind of benefit. And look, frankly, as well, and I'm happy to kind of say this out loud, it helps consultants like me that are going into practices to be able to actually do that work, because rather than having to sort of, do manual kind of either audits or reviews myself, or kind of workshops that surface that data, um, again, in some of the ways that I've mentioned, being able to have a tool that you can actually use to be able to get into that level of detail is super helpful. And look, I think kind of more broadly, automation um, plays a huge part in this kind of industry moving forward in all sorts of capacity, be that across, automating kind of like data flow, automating bookkeeping, automating reporting, whatever it ends up being. That's going to be one of the kind of, I think, continued buzzwords that people hear over the next sort of, 6, 12 months and beyond. And yeah, I think being able to leverage automation to be able to sort of surface some of those insights that we're talking about, yeah, super, super helpful.
Yeah, and I think that makes a great point in terms of like, automating reporting, automating, some of this discovery work and things like that. Um, One of the things that I have heard, and I think is interesting, and you can speak more to it, I'm sure, is that when you're able to automate simple just data flows, then you can use your human element at a higher capacity for the more thoughtful, strategic insights and things like that, as opposed to poring over the spreadsheets and highlighting, oh, that's a subscription. Or like my example earlier, I will export my CSV from here and import my CSV to there. If we can use those tools, then in my opinion, I feel like we can use our people at a higher level. Is that appropriate thinking for this market, or is that me bringing external perspectives that are not quite on par?
I I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that what you've just described is probably kind of cut and paste across multiple other kind of like, examples that we're starting to see across both accountancy and beyond in terms of automation and technology, not replacing what kind of people do, but being able to kind of make the work that people do more value add, more kind of efficient, more interesting, all of those sorts of things. And I think, you know, if you want to use that same kind of example that you just gave, I don't think anybody, if you put another poll up, would kind of vote that they preferred sitting down and manually kind of like marking with a highlighter on a spreadsheet kind of pieces of software that are in use versus actually using their time to kind of interpret the data that's come out of a tool like Adventure or whatever else to be able to make kind of more prescriptive, more kind of tailored sort of like advisory type recommendations and actually do more interesting stuff. And for me, that's where this whole industry just evolves more holistically, right? I think we kind of we're quickly getting into a point where a lot of that kind of lower level, less valuable, kind of more repetitive, boring, mundane stuff ends up being replaced by automation, AI, whatever else to actually kind of free up people's time to be able to actually do more interesting work. And look, for me, I think I talked about this a bit at DAS this year, and we'll continue to preach about it probably for the rest of this year and beyond. But for me, good people are always going to have a role in the world of accountancy. I don't think it matters where they're based in the world. And ultimately, technology is going to become a huge enabler to be able to actually deliver all that type of work, but just at a pace that's more profitable, more accurate, and more kind of interesting for the people that are doing it.
Yeah. Well, now we've used all the big three A's. We've used automation, API, and AI. So I think
There we
we've
go.
covered
Bingo
the
card.
absolutely. We should start doing inventory bingo cards. That would be cool. So, let's step ahead. A firm's completed their tech audit, whether they did it manually, with a tool, with a consultant, a combination of the three. And they've uncovered some of those gaps or inefficiencies. So then the real work begins, right? Like, how do we take, oh, there's a gap, there's an overlap, there's a problem. How do we take that information and turn it into a plan?
Yeah. I mean, I think well, if I answer this through the through the lens of maybe the modern firm, and then perhaps as a more kind of general piece of advice. I mean, personally,
Absolutely.
we've got a bunch of kind of I guess reports and templates that can kind of feed data into that we're surfacing that kind of presents all of the findings and insights in a really kind of digestible, really quite user-friendly, kind of insightful way to a firm. And ultimately, those reports and packs kind of give a practice owner an entire sort of end-to-end I guess, playbook really as to kind of what the existing state looks like, and what the future state could look like off the back of all of the workshops and discovery we've done based on the insights and recommendations that go into that report. I think, if you're a firm that's wanting to kind of undergo and do that exercise yourself by way of kind of following some of the processes and principles that we've talked about, I think the only real way to be able to kind of, sort of, take action really is to kind of produce at least a version of that in terms of an implementation plan, a kind of roadmap, a timeline, whatever you want to call it. Because I think for me, it's not just about surfacing the right technology solutions. It's doing so in conjunction with a proper change management plan that actually takes the company on the journey as well. Because again, I think one of the huge problems that we see in many practices, again, that I've either worked in or that I've kind of talked to recently, is that implementing a piece of technology is great, but if no one understands it or no one uses it or no one can actually kind of, figure out kind of how it's going to benefit them, then it's a complete waste of time and a complete waste of money. So you need to have the change management there. You need to have the appropriate level of training. You need to have the appropriate level of kind of project documentation and kind of like SOP templates or whatever they are to be able to help people use the platforms. But I think timing is ultimately hugely important as well. Again, if I go back to this firm that I've been working with recently, the kind of larger one of the two examples that I gave, um, there's some work that we're thinking about already off the back of the sessions that we've had around how we can improve some of their tax return, both production and kind of working paper process around sort of some of their self-assessment clients. Now, we've kind of talked about sort of at a really high level, again, without getting into too many details around any of these things that we talk about. We're not going to want to start ripping out their current sort of solution in the middle of December, January this year, for example, because that's right in the heart of tax season, and that's going to end up causing a whole host of pain and problems. Now, that's a really really easy example to give, but I guess my point more broadly is that, again, identifying a particular solution is one thing, but ensuring that it fits into a proper timeline that's actually kind of considering all of those types of factors around sort of pain points, or pinch points, I should say, from a capacity perspective or a client delivery perspective, are super important. So I think regardless of whether you're using an external consultancy or doing this project internally, you need to have a well-structured, well-thought-out implementation plan and change management plan to be able to do it.
So we talked about a lot of planning. I'm a big planner. How do firms avoid getting stuck in that planning phase and pick a starting point to really kick this off?
Well, look, I'm going to be quite biased with this answer and suggest that sometimes engaging an external kind of party to be able to help keep momentum and drive things along is a more proactive way of doing it. And I think the reality is a lot of smaller firms just don't have the capacity or the internal resource to be able to deliver these projects themselves. And that's why I think a lot of firms end up falling kind of through the cracks, because again, back to it, they're good at identifying where the problems are. They're good at identifying the particular pieces of technology that might solve it, but they just do not have the capacity to run a full end-to-end kind of change management implementation plan. And so I think if you kind of ask yourself those questions and conclude that is the case, I think external support can be super helpful for that. It's what we do at the Modern Firm. Or if you have got the internal resource or the capacity to do it, you just need to ensure that you free up kind of the appropriate amount of resource kind of on a non sort of chargeable basis to be able to actually kind of get their head down and just do it. It's as simple as that. I think that's the only way that you can kind of like not get stuck into this kind of monotonous cycle of constant kind of change fatigue, or kind of, being bogged down in planning or procrastination or whatever you want to call it. You need to have the kind of internal resource to be able to actually execute on that project. And again, back to my whole theory that many firms, certainly kind of at the smaller end of the market, maybe sub 100 people, have got, they're operating quite lean models in terms of, not having lots of people sitting around with lots of capacity to do anything other than client work. A lot of those people at a more junior level have got utilization targets or billable targets of, 95+%, and it just doesn't free up much, if any, capacity to actually get stuff done. And I don't think doing any of this stuff in a half-baked way is helpful. I think if you're ultimately going to rip the plaster off and do it, you need to do that and do it properly, because if you don't, you just end up in this kind of cycle that we've been talking about throughout. And so I think the key thing, or the key way of not getting stuck into that kind of, or being bogged down in planning, or kind of, again, change fatigue or whatever else, is just having the right level of resource to be able to do the job.
Right. And that level of commitment. And I think you made a great point when you were talking about using an external party as kind of that forcing function, because you're making an investment. You only have them as part of the team, usually for a limited period of time. So you really, as you said, need to pull the plaster off and do that to get out of what I like to call plan procrastination. You are just
Completely.
simply um, continuing to plan and saying, well, when we have time, we will do this. Well, when this other thing happens, then we'll do that. So I think
Um,
those
a-
are great tips.
Absolutely. And look, I think just to kind of like labor that point one more time, that although I wouldn't put myself in this camp of being somebody that enjoys doing like DIY and stuff at weekends, or full stop, in fact, but I think there are lots of people that enjoy the thought of kind of like building their own extension or decorating their own kitchen and stuff. But when life gets in the way and when things get busy and stuff, you can sometimes end up in this cycle of having kind of your, sort of, a job that would take a professional maybe a couple of days to be able to finish end to end, taking kind of days, if not weeks, to actually finish. And you're surrounded by paint pots or building blocks or whatever it is and stuff. And you end up just living in this kind of disorganized chaos for that period whilst it's needing to be finished. When the reality is, if you'd bought a professional tradesman in at the beginning to actually just do the work, yes, it would cost money up front, but you would have the kind of reliability and the accountability in a way that you wouldn't have if you were doing a lot of that stuff yourself, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. We just went through that at my house with building a new computer. Finally outsourced that to the experts, and I got the craft table back. So
yeah.
absolutely, there's a ton of different opportunities there. Well, just before we start to wrap things up, I want to remind everyone that we do have a few minutes for Q&A with Luke. I've already got one question, but if anyone else has other questions in there, please drop them into the Q&A session, and I'm going to open up poll number 2. But before I do, um, Luke, as people are approaching this, as people have listened to this webinar, what's the key takeaway that you want them to take back to their firm, go back and be thinking about? Um, what's that final golden nugget that you would want to leave people with?
I think for me at the moment, the industry in general is at such an interesting and quite important juncture when it comes to actually kind of what's coming down the track. I don't think the buzzwords that we've talked about so far in terms of automation and AI, and to an extent API, the three A's, is going to be a kind of new revolution to most people. That narrative has now been around for some time. But I think the reality is we're on the cusp now of all of that stuff, not just becoming more mainstream, but actually becoming kind of like fundamental to the existence of firms moving forward. And I think for me, if there's one message that I can kind of relay both on this webinar and to the kind of accounting community more generally over the next kind of 6 to 12 months, it's that people really need to start leaning into that kind of expectation that this industry and this world is changing at pace. I think fixing the kind of foundations and getting the kind of fundamentals sorted are going to set everybody up for success to really sort of leverage the true benefits that are coming with those sorts of things. And I don't think burying kind of heads in sand and kind of procrastinating and proclaiming that this stuff isn't going to be as impactful as it actually is helpful. So I think people really just need to kind of sort of lean into that and either come up with that internal plan themselves to figure out how they're going to kind of evolve their practice, or kind of look at what kind of external options exist to them to be able to help really modernize and bring them into a more sort of kind of current modern way of working.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that, Luke. So our poll question was, based on what you've learned today, do you feel more equipped to evaluate and upgrade your firm's tech stack to reduce costs and improve efficiency? And it's awesome because the majority of people are saying yes, that they did get that outcome, which is exactly what we were striving for here. So our first question that we had come in is, what is, in your opinion, the best way to avoid tech subscriptions mounting up and having better visibility?
I mean, I think it's a lot of what we've kind of been alluding to throughout, and it's kind of having that regular ongoing monitoring or audit or whatever you want to call it. And again, there's tech out there that can do that sort of stuff. AppVenture is obviously an example of that. But even if you're kind of a firm that doesn't believe you're ready for that solution yet, or kind of just for some reason can't wrap your head around doing it tech enabled, then again, just a monthly kind of reconciliation. I mean, I'm sure every accountant on this call is doing a monthly reconciliation of their bank account. So I don't mean that literally in terms of just reconciling the account, but actually taking some time to stop and think about what's actually in there, and then setting aside maybe 30 minutes kind of once a month to actually kind of like run through that list of kind of data and actually kind of actioning it if it's not in use. Because again, I think if you're sitting there on Zero or QuickBooks or whatever it is and reconciling your bank, sometimes it's very easy to click like yes or okay or whatever it is on something without putting too much thought into what that kind of longer term impact looks like. So I think the only real way to do it is to kind of have that regular ongoing kind of audit of what your tech spend looks like.
Wonderful. Our next question from the audience: as an industry with a huge range of tools and applications available, what steps would you suggest to cut through the noise and identify the crucial ones that should be utilized?
I think that that latter point is pretty spot on. There is just a lot of noise out there that exists, and I think, as I've referenced briefly earlier, I think vendors are very good at being able to kind of showcase and demonstrate why their particular platform will do a particularly good job at solving one particular problem. But I think where that starts to get noisy is when you're not considering it as part of a more kind of holistic strategy, as I keep banging that drum. And I think for me, the only real way to cut through the noise and actually work out kind of what best in class looks like and kind of, what is fit for purpose versus what not, is actually kind of like considering whether the technology or the app that you're looking at is going to fit as part of your wider sort of practice structure. And I think, where you've got examples of, I don't know, without picking on a particular silo, but payments is quite a good area to kind of like zoom in on. There are so many different kind of providers that exist in the payment space that all proclaim to be the best at what they do. And look, I'm not going to start to kind of draw favorites on who I think kind of operates best in that space. But I think where you've got kind of silo specific noise, if you like, around kind of apps and vendors kind of proclaiming that they're better than their competitors and stuff. I think, the reality is that's where the kind of support from an external impartial consultant can become really helpful because, again, I personally am not either affiliated to nor aligned to any kind of like software or vendor that exists in the space, but have got a relatively kind of well structured kind of view on what all of the different apps in the respective areas look and feel like. And I think sometimes just having a sounding board to be able to actually kind of like, validate whether or not it is just noise or whether it is kind of genuine concern is really helpful. And so, and beyond that, we could keep going in terms of just doing your research and kind of like, talking to kind of like competitors, sorry, talking to colleagues and those sorts of things and industry peers. But yeah, there is a lot of noise out there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think I appreciate what you said about the vendors do a good job. It is our jobs, I can say this as the marketer, to make our products sound appealing, sound useful, all of those kinds of things, and incentivize you to want to sign up for us. So if the people in my role are doing their jobs, it makes your job much harder, Luke. So I appreciate that dichotomy between the two of us. I'll leave the question box open if anybody has any last minute questions, but just kind of to wrap up kind of what we've talked about with Luke today. We looked at how to audit your current tech stack, spot where tools, systems, or workflows are falling short, and Luke shared some really great insights on how we end up with our stacks of tech that are not necessarily working well together or are being underutilized, and how that can cost firms both time and money. We also looked at how to align your tech spend with actual usage. And the point really that we discussed there is that data matters and getting visibility is the key to eliminating waste, improving ROI, and even improving how our staffs are able to work and be successful and satisfied with their jobs. We also talked about how automation is transforming tech overall, not just tech discovery, but so many components of how we're using tech in our firms. And Luke gave us some glimpses into how firms are using automated tools to replace guesswork, accelerate decision making, and really, again, improve the quality of work and quality of space for our staffs as well. And then we talked on the importance of getting the projects started and how we identify friction points, get the team on board, and really get past the planning procrastination and start getting things moving. So I don't see any other questions that have come in today. First of all, thank you to all of our attendees for coming, listening to Luke and I today, caring about the technology in your firm and how to improve it. I really appreciate it. And also, of course, to Luke from the Modern Firm, thank you so much for generously providing your time and your insights today for this audience, because I do think, as we were talking about before we started this session today, that having the right tech in your firm is not just a competitive advantage now, it's really becoming table stakes for firms to be able to evolve and grow in the future. So thank you so much, Luke, for your time today.
No problem. Thank you very much indeed for having me.